Forward. The following story is not meant for children. There will be uncensored swearing, themes of self-hatred, and graphic depictions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. The Godeater, the Crossroads, Saki, Tenki, and Miss X are all owned by Vashley and the Summer League's organizers. Quinn and Associated Works are owned by Wooden Sponge. Summer League's Round 1, Chapter 5. The room was tacky. A waterfall fell into a stream that flowed across the center of the room. The table was made of black marble with gold inlay, jade statues posed dramatically at the edges of the windows, drapes made of silk, paintings depicting the Crossroads hung on the walls, along with the portraits of the Godeater and her children. Nalagram stood in this den of ostentatiousness and squinted. Something was amiss here.
Hey boss, this is a swanky place, ain't it?
A well-dressed ghost wearing a brimmed hat floated in, his body riddled with bullet holes as he looked around with just a little awe.
"It's loud, Herman, not classy,"
Nalagram replied, stepping over the tripping hazard that was the 2-foot-deep stream. He walked over to one of the closed doors, tall and red with a brass handle.
You don't like it?
The ghost asked, floating up behind Nalagram curiously as he opened the door. It led to a bedroom with a massive bed covered in maroon sheets and lined with candles.
"It's not about liking, Herman. It's about principle,"
Nalagram replied as he closed the door.
"Any luck finding that fridge?"
Yeah, boss, I found it.
Herman nodded, floating off to another room that featured an oak bar. Beside it sat a miniature, plain white fridge. Nalagram knelt down beside it and tugged it open with a jingling thud. Sitting inside of it had been a large sum of beers, all labeled and very expensive looking. He began chucking them over his shoulder.
Boss?
Herman sounded concerned at the sound of the first crash.
Don't you think the Godeater will be upset that you're trashing a joint like this?
As the fridge was emptied and copious amounts of glass and beer littered the floor, Nalagram stuck his hand all the way to the back of the white box.
"Oh, you don't have to be worried about that, Herman, my friend who has always been here."
His hand thudded against the back of the refrigerator.
"Because this ain't the Godeater's apartment."
Suddenly, Nalagram was aware of his own heartbeat, the breath that he had been taking in. It was like a switch had been flipped on reality, and now everything had been different. Everything was different. He was kneeling down in the middle of an alleyway, his hand resting on a pile of garbage that seemed awfully familiar. A bag had been torn open and the contents thrust upon the ground. There was a predator watching over him.
"To be fair, I knew it was a dimension door the moment I walked in,"
the apprentice stated confidently, rising to his feet so his cloak covered his body. His hands were shaking. His heart was thumping. He needed to keep control of his breathing or the game was up. "The door wasn't enchanted." The Godeater's voice slithered into the alley as she stood against the backdrop of an unnaturally large and bright moon, her eyes bright against the shadow of her silhouette.
"The key was,"
Nalagram replied, tossing an ornate metal key on the ground.
"I mean, come on. I've seen how modern this place is. This is just tacky."
She was suddenly in front of him, a flash of anger in her eyes that faded like a snuffed light. Curiosity remained. "Why are you here?" she asked, tilting her head as her eyes bore into his skull. "Answer my question to my satisfaction, and I'll give you the key." They were piercing like daggers and searching like bloodhounds. Nalagram's head thumped to the rhythmic hum of magic that he could feel in the air. Magic that shattered his grinning teeth in the back of his skull. The hood hid his eyes, so he closed them. If he were to keep eye contact, he'd lose focus. Breathe. Don't think. Nothing existed but here and now.
"Why, Godeater? That is a very broad question."
His voice thrummed in the air like the strum of a bass guitar, following the rhythm of the magic in the air.
"Perhaps you could specify further."
The sound of a shoe hitting gravel sounded in his ear as the Godeater took a step. She was moving. She was pacing. She was stalking. The sound of a splash snapped Nalagram to reality like a broken limb. His teeth were grit in a wild, excited smile that hid the sweat dripping from his face. It wasn't sweat, though. but rather pond water. He opened his eyes to find himself upon a lily pad that he had always been on, of course. He sat openly, in defiance to a heron with wild white and gold feathers in the background. It had been stepping around the water, watching him. "What is your wish? What is your intent with the Crossroads? And what are you planning?" Her voice resonated in Nalagram's ears over the sound of deafening insects and rippling waters as the heron took another step. Nalagram closed his eyes again as survival instincts started to take control of him. Spiders crawled up his spine. Little needles poked into his face as he fought to maintain composure.
"I want to fight you,"
he said simply and plainly. It would do him no good to lie here. Splashes rang out like the crash of cymbals as Nalagram heard the heron charging. He remained on his lily pad despite how the water rocked and bucked. He could feel the jaws of the bird flying towards the back of his skull. A squawk of a bird, a splash of water, the clap of a stage light coming to life. Nalagram opened his eyes again to the sound of the Godeater laughing gently like the lower notes of a flute. They were on a stage, an audience of empty faces looking upon them. She was a showstopper with a brilliant white dress with 9 trails. He was dressed as an uppity stagehand who had taken center stage. The crowd was laughing with her. "I'm certain you remember how well our last encounter went," she replied as the back of her hand lowered from her cheek. "Are you certain you want to risk death again?" Nalagram merely continued to grin. He'd been used to being the fool. His legs swept dramatically in the air and over his head before landing delicately behind him like a bird upon a branch.
"It's not death I'm afraid of, but never living, Godeater,"
he replied, bowing his head and closing his eyes once more before they met the madam's. His hands floated to the sides of his skull as though in deference with a lowered gaze. The click of a heel, the frush of fabric, the splatting of a tomato on wood. He opened his eyes one last time to find himself a jester in the stockade. She had been an insulted monarch interrogating her detractor. "Do you intend to destroy the Crossroads?" she asked, her eyes still locked on the man. Nalagram laughed heartily, a genuine one despite the situation.
"The hell would I want to do that for? Can't play with a broken toy, you know."
A tomato careened into his face, splattering all over his head and dripping sloppily onto the ground to the applause of empty faces surround him. Still he grinned, even when looking down at the offending produce. Her head leaned down to stare at him, her eyes locking with his as icy daggers dug into the back of his neck. "What is your name?"
"You can call me Nalagram, Godeater."
The Godeater's head tilted to the side, long hair bound to the appearance of 9 tails shifting in the air. "What about Graz?" Nalagram's eyes turned up, focusing purely on her despite the throbbing in his head. He needed to show defiance here.
"You don't get to call me that. Never that,"
he stated, his voice even and plain. She stepped backwards, her eyes still searching. He closed his eyes to follow the rhythm of the conversation once more. A step on cobblestone, the jeer of a crowd, the "How do you like your choice of opponent?" Nalagram released a breath that he hadn't known he'd been holding. The universe snapped into place as his eyes shot open and ragged gasps for air freely left his mouth. His cloak draped over him. Now his cloak again. The sounds of a party could be heard downstairs, and the moon's light pierced through a nearby window. His smile slipped.
"So that was you,"
he growled, pulling himself up.
"That's a dirty trick, pitting a lamb against a lion."
"It wouldn't be much of a challenge if it wasn't challenging." The Godeater's voice rang out overhead, though she was nowhere to be seen. "Remember, you may win or lose, but it's my entertainment that your continued participation hinges on." His hands shook violently from beneath his cloak. His heart pounded over and over. A cold sweat poured down from his face as he tried to regain his composure. She was gone now. Her voice faded and her presence went missing. For the first time in a very long time, he'd been rattled. Knocked down a peg or two in terms of pride. Something was in his palm. He brought his hand out of his cloak, still shaking, and opened the clenched fist to find a tiny little key in his hand with a little bell attached to it.
Boss, help, I've been displaced!
Herman's voice came crying from outside the dark room as Nalagrom fixed the bell to the clasp of his cloak.
I'm lost to time and space! Oh, my mother always told me this would happen!
Calm down.
Nalagrom called from his spot as his nerves finally calmed down enough to speak. He snapped his fingers and a fire lit itself, illuminating the new place he'd found himself in, unsure of what to expect with that drug trip he'd just been on. It was plain. Very plain, actually. The furniture was simple, the decoration was mundane, hell, the place was just plain small. There was a window, though, with a great view of the Crossroads to boot. The pagoda was in the background, with the moon hanging just behind it.
Boss, where are you?
The ghost cried, his voice muffled and desperate. Nalagrom rolled his eyes and walked over to the door to the outside to open it. When he did, he saw the suited ghost flying around in a tizzy. He stopped and stared wide at Nalagrom before speeding towards him in relief.
Boss! Don't you ever scare me like that again! What happened?
A lot of bullshit, that's what happened.
Nalagrom replied, shoving the key into his pocket.
Come on, let's go check out our new digs.
The ghost floated behind Nalagrom as the necromancer reached out to flick a light switch that had been next to the door to bring the true and proper light to this tiny little den. Nalagrom had walked over to a refrigerator, this one significantly taller than the previous, and yanked it open to find it well stocked with food and snacks. And still copious amounts of alcohol. Lush. He reached his arm into the icebox, taking his time to move and reorganize the food a little. What is this place, boss? Herman asked disbelievingly over his shoulder. When Nalagrom found that his whole arm and shoulder ran into the box, a chuckle escaped his mouth. Pay dirt.
This, Herman, is the Godeater's personal apartment. Ours for our brief stay in the Crossroads.
Nalagrom replied cheerily, ideas already forming in his head.
This stinky old place.
The ghost floated around.
The hell you want this place for? The hotel had nicer rooms than this.
Because I refuse to stay at a place called the Kids Inn. Do you hear me?
Nalagrom shook his fist as his glare stopped Herman in his place. He released a breath. He didn't hate puns, but he hated that pun.
Also, we're not gonna be sleeping here.
His mood was improving by the moment as hot air balloons floated up to the top of his skull, lifting him to his toes as he bounded over to a desk that he pulled the drawers of gingerly. A hefty stack of paper and a little tray filled with pencils emerged. Nalagrom took a heavy stack of them and set them on the nice oak desk. When he looked back down at the drawer, he saw that the paper had automatically refilled itself. He nearly exploded right then and there with absolute exuberance.
Herman, my man, get me a new set of clothes for my things. I got inspiration to work with now.
This is another one of those chapters that I really wanted to write. But it was one that I had planned before once I started digging through the scene, so yeah, it was yeah. Sorry about the audio quality of this episode, by the way. This was with a new recording technique, so I'm not going to be using this one in the future. Apologies.